ready for the panel discussion. And before that, let me thank all the speakers for presenting your country's situation and update us on the FITS study. So are there any questions from the floor? Yes, ma'am. Yes?
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation of so much rich data. It's really interesting from across the world. It's such a valuable resource. I think Dr. Wang and Dr. Agedeppa alluded to the fact, particularly the last speaker, Dr. Agedeppa, sorry if I haven't pronounced your name correctly, that 24-hour recalls tend to underestimate energy intake, and it was very obvious in your study. So I just wonder whether we're seeing an overestimation of micronutrient inadequacy because of the underestimation of energy intake. For example, the data from China is quite a large age span. So if you adjusted the data for energy intake, it might slightly alter the micronutrient overestimation of micronutrient deficiency or inadequacies. Do you look at that in your data?
Actually, we are trying to disaggregate our data into smaller age groups and try to find out the inadequacy level in each age group as per our Philippine recommended dietary intake guidelines. So we have actually the data on PDRI, but the data that we have is actually ranging from 6 to 9, 10 to 12. So since we look at our PDRI values, it's actually almost similar in terms of the requirement, so we just lump it together to 6 to 12 years old. So the inadequacy level of micronutrients that I have put into that slide is almost that kind of inadequacy, the real inadequacy.
I think the question will be into two parts. So first is about the energy intake. The question is whether we underestimate the energy actually intake compared to the requirements. We did actually adjust it according to different ages, different age groups. I show only from 4 to 13 years old, but actually there are 3 age groups in between. So 4 to 6, 7 to 10, and 11 to 13. Whereas everybody compared to its own EER, so the estimated energy requirement. And the second part is about micronutrient intakes. In some studies, we did adjust it by energy, but not for all, so I have to admit that. But the overestimation part, I think mainly is from where we don't have EAR set up. So we don't have sufficient evidence to set up EAR, and that makes the comparison a little bit tricky. Because when you compare to the AI, and we have shown in the graph, it normally is higher than the EAR, because we don't know the EAR, so we have to compare to AI, the adequate intake. So if you compare to that, and then obviously it will overestimate the inadequacy. So that's probably where it's come from. But we make it very careful in terms of interpretation. We normally use, if it's one-day recall, we use only the means. And in theory, the means doesn't change even you take one-day recall or 7-day recall. So the mean normally stay as where it is. And we don't say normally what is exactly percentage of children below the AI. We tend to say this is this children is likely, or this group of children is likely to have this problem. But in terms of exact percentage, we are quite cautious on that.
Okay, are there other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have a comment and then I have a question. I thought I'd start a little debate here. My comment is for NNI and for the FIT study. As you know, they're reconvening the whole dietary guideline process on how they're going to put the committee together and how they're going to evaluate the evidence. And I was in the inside scoop for a little while, and then I got out. Cross-sectional studies will not be allowed according to my impression when I first was on the committee, will be allowed as available evidence in the 2020 dietary guidelines. As you know, that is below the quality of science for prospective studies and randomized controlled trials. So although I appreciate the importance of FIT study, and I am an epidemiologist by training, it's unfortunate, and I did fight for it, to try to get them to understand the beauty of cross-sectional studies in generating research gaps and hypotheses. So that's just an FYI. But my question, and I'll give you my quick opinion, when you're doing national data sets, you do have outliers. You have underreporting, overreporting. That's understandably. But then people have a tendency to say it's implausible, energy intake, based on your body just can't function that way. Well, I'm sure all of you have had days that your eating patterns have been inadequate. I mean, certainly mine yesterday was inadequate, flying all around the world. So it's not necessarily implausible, but it is a atypical pattern. So I like to use the word atypical and not implausible. So as a research epidemiologist, yes, you do have a distribution. You got highly skewed at the lower ends. And my question is, do you exclude them from the analyses, or do you keep them in because that's just the way the American population eats?
For this particular analysis, we did not exclude any outliers. And that's because there were not extremes that we see in older adults. And for example, in NHANES, I did an analysis with B12, and there were 2 women who had 150,000 micrograms of vitamin B12, and everyone else was like at 2.1. And so, you know, those are easy. Those cases are easy. But there's always those tough questions in how you handle the data. And for this is a beautiful thing for me because RTI does the data. This is the first time I've ever worked on a study where I wasn't the programmer. So a lot of those tough decisions they made at the RTI level. But from my understanding from asking those questions is that the intakes were more homogeneous in infants and the young children than we see with adults.
Okay, there is a question from the floor for Dr. Agedeppa. You mentioned that milk, a nutrient-dense food, played a little role in the diet. Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, because based on our food sources, since since milk is not a major source of calcium, and milk never appeared in our food sources for the different micronutrients. And what is the other question? Why fruits?
Why do you think this is the case?
Why this is the case? We know very well that children are not eating much vegetables and fruits, and also thinking about the environment of the Philippines, fruits and vegetables are seldom really eaten by our school kids. Not until such time we discovered that when we actually develop a vegetable recipe that is actually very palatable and attractive to the school kids and gave them for the supplementary feeding, then they are attractive. In the first 2 weeks of feeding, they actually throw the vegetables in the meal. So they put it underneath. Now after, that's why we said it's a repetition of giving this kind of vegetables so that you can train the taste buds and so on. So what we did was actually to serve that every now and then for the cycle menu that is actually given in the supplementary feeding the school children. So why is this so? It's just because, you know, children really don't like vegetables, and seldom they get the fruits. I also consider the cost of giving fruit to our children. And that's also the question of our Department of Agriculture, why fruit consumption in the Philippines is actually going down. First is the accessibility and the affordability.
Yeah. So it's about the milk, Melda. So is it possible we are not milk drinkers as a rule? And we stop drinking milk after a certain age?
Yeah, but based on our community studies, we are not really milk drinkers, but these current times, we are actually going to that because milk intake is increasing in our food consumption survey. But it's not that way that we wanted to be, meaning to say, because only about 14-15% are actually consuming milk in the 6 to 12-year-old children.
Okay, another question for Dr. Agedeppa. You mentioned that milk, no, the other one. Would EO51 milk code be a deterrent to child nutrition, especially in poor rural areas?
This is a very political question. Salvador is telling me political question. Yes, EO51 is very restricted. And if we educate parents on proper nutrition, and we know very well that exclusive breastfeeding will last until 6 months, exclusive breastfeeding. Then we actually give proper complementary feeding that includes milk. That's a very safe answer.
Okay, other questions, ma'am.
So I have one question for Dr. Villalpando about Mexico and one for Dr. Bailey about the US. So about Mexico, I was very surprised by the amount of protein from, energy intake from protein in high-income parents. I think it was about 26%. From my point of view, it's very high. So I was wondering what was the dietary pattern behind that. And concerning the American study, concerning the guidelines, dietary guidelines for Americans that are being prepared, and especially for the youngest one, B to 24 months, I was wondering whether the recommendation would be different for breastfed infant and formula-fed infants.
Well, for the high income, 26% of in the share of stomach, I think most of it comes from milk. And as I said, there's not a lot of milk after 2 years of age. But still, most of the protein comes from milk, and there's very little meat. There's some egg and egg dishes, but most of the protein, there is a lot of consumption of milks, formulas early in life, but it's mainly where it comes from.
And as for the dietary guidelines 2020 to 2025, I think we're all anxiously awaiting what the recommendations are going to be, and especially in light of Dr. Nicholas's comment that cross-sectional data won't be used, and it's going to be very difficult because there's not a lot of experimental data in infants to make food-based recommendations. So I'm as questioning as you are as what the guidelines are going to look like. I think they would have to make differential recommendations based on feeding type, but that's just speculation, honestly.
Yeah, I'm just asking because the EPSCAN in Europe, the Committee on Nutrition recommended timidly different eating patterns for breastfed or formula-fed children. So,
sorry to in our consensus, we also did formula-fed and breastfed recommendations separately, but mainly because of energy consumption. You know, formula-fed babies should decrease all means of extra energy consumption, and breastfed babies should increase whatsoever iron consumption. And it came 3 months before Espagan.
Yes, please.
Thanks again to all the speakers for the great data set. My question is, how now do you want to use the data set, the huge information? Because as we just heard, in some cases we cannot use it for guidelines. In practical terms, practical working with industries, communities, networking, because I think it's nice to do a study like that over years, but what exactly are you doing it to really hopefully try to make a change? Because we know it's actually, we have the information years and years, but the situation won't change.
I can I can perhaps respond to that. I think the idea is that we do want to use the data for change. We want to use the data to support changes in education to parents through the Start Healthy, Stay Healthy program. And we as a company want to be responsible with our data and make different decisions about either the offerings that we have in the marketplace or about improving the offerings that we have in the marketplace. And we have some very good examples of that in countries where the study has been going on for a couple of years. I'm sure you can appreciate that the pipeline for new products takes some time to implement. And so, for example, in Mexico, where we've really documented low intakes of fruits and vegetables, and also high consumption of beverages for little children that consume quite large amounts of sugar, we can look at that situation and say, what can we do as a company in a responsible way to address those problems? Offer more products for children that contain fruits and vegetables, and offer beverages for children that don't contain so much sugar.
Yes, it's like 42 different products from Nestle have changed their recipe for lowering or taking out all sugar, all sodium in stage 1, and which didn't happen until 2 years ago, and a lot more varieties of vegetables and fruits available for babies, and also having to do with public policy. It's been an effort, and there's been a lot of lobbying in order to change that last step for our national regulations. One of the steps is doing like this expert panel consultation and publishing it, so it does get to the ministry ears, and he has like data to talk about in planning new surveys and doing public policy changes.
In the Philippines, we have the National Nutrition Committee, wherein this is actually an organization by different nutrition-related implementing agencies. So our data actually is being used by the National Nutrition Council in developing our Philippine Plan of Action from 2016 to 2025. And our data also has been used by our National Economic Development Authority for the development plans. For the Department of Agriculture, we have been actually trying to actually tell them about all these kind of food insufficiencies and inadequacies in our population, and they're trying also their best to match production versus consumption. Well, the Department of Health, as usual, is actually the user of our data, the Department of Social Welfare and Development. So research like these are very important to us. It's just because our policymakers, our politicians actually ask for evidence-based data whenever they craft laws, whenever they craft their own, bills or policies.
And I think a lot of the data that's presented here today can be used as a basis to design some intervention or clinical studies that are needed. Across almost all of the countries, we talked about very high sodium. Some efforts obviously need to be made to reduce sodium intakes. How can we do that? Will it be acceptable from a sensory perspective, from a food safety perspective? So I think not only, in some of the other applications that we've talked about, but hopefully to stimulate other research that can be more informative.
Just add 2 points. So first is about internal, what we can do and what we can offer as a company to address those nutrition gaps we found in the study. And we have heard a lot. We have launched a new product. Another way to look at it is also because we fortify different foods, and we also review whether we fortify the right thing, whether it needs to be fortified or whether we fortify some others. So this is, we can still look at data and check if we do the right thing. And the second is externally, besides engaging in different policy makings, we can also actually engage in media, social media, news network, public newspapers. Last year we have a pretty big China kids nutrition conference focused on children. And that's, I think, attract a lot of attention, because we all know people, sometimes they say, you don't need to do study, we know we will missing some calcium, vitamin D. But what is very striking is they don't know the magnitude of this problem. So now people realize this is a big problem, so we have to do something about it. So we engage the education sectors, educate the media sectors. So the end aim is to fill those gaps.
Can I make a comment? In fact, you told the policies have to be made, but the thing is, unless we bring out a change in the knowledge, attitude and practice and the behavioral changes in the parents, it is very difficult to implement these changes. Whatever research you have done should be practicality of that research into action should be taken. For example, India, we have a lot of, food is not a scarce commodity, but the parental attitude towards the food is totally different. For example, though we say red meat is rich in iron, should be given early to take care of the iron content, but still for those with the non-vegetarian background also, they don't give the red meat for cultural reasons till 1 year or till 1.5 years. And fruits they don't give because of some myths and beliefs, even in an educated thing. So with that background, there was an NGO in one of the cities who went to the school. It is for little older children, maybe kindergarten or primary school. They tried to bring out the change in the children because they found that changing the parents was very difficult. So they tried to educate the children that every day you should have a good breakfast, because they used to come to the school with only 1 glass of milk or a small biscuits. The energy, they get drained out by the time they come out of the school. So the children were educated, and over a period of time, they found that the consumption of fruits, vegetables, or a good breakfast in the morning really improved. And that NGO took care of few schools, and they saw a drastic improvement even in the scholastic performance or the academic performance also, in addition to the energy levels of the child. So I think these models can be implemented in a larger scale based on these studies, because just doing a study and keeping may not work, but practicality of the problem, implementation of the things. And I think even the healthcare professional has to be, because we found that the time given by the healthcare professional in counseling the nutritional thing is very less, especially in a country like India. Whatever problem they come, they just treat and send. But nutrition is a part of the child's overall care. So nobody gives a counseling session even for a minute or two. So that's what I was discussing with Natalia, that there was a study how much the knowledge, attitude of the healthcare professionals regarding these complementary or supplementary feeds. I think these things should be put into practice, then it will have more value.
Okay,
Can I
other
just add?
questions? Yes.
Just a comment as a corollary to what Dr. Shina has already said. Though I do agree with what he says, but me being from the government sector, I strongly feel that your approach towards policy and program mainstreaming would be more sustainable. Because, of course, we do agree that a lot of NGOs do a lot of good work, but to make it sustainable and mainstream it into the policies and programs would give a better effect in the long run. So ultimately, even healthcare professionals do work in systems. So system modifications have to happen. I think the data and the evidence which is being generated would be very strongly advocating for changes in the system and in policies and programs. I think that's a very correct method of approach in this way.
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to ask Regan a question. Some of the nutrients that were high in the United States, to what extent is fortification responsible for that? And is there any drive towards regulatory control?
Yeah, so the primary source is not fortification for retinol. For zinc, I'm not as sure about, but it's coming from the animal sources is where the retinol is. For the zinc, I'm not exactly sure. I think it's more of an issue of the upper limit not being, the upper limit for vitamin A was set on bulging fontanelles in 2 kids, I think. And so to make a public recommendation that above that level is going to put children at risk, I think it's more of an issue of the UL being perhaps too low.
Other questions? Yes, Dr.
I would like to ask this question to Dr. Wang and also Dr. Agedeppa. Myself coming from Malaysia within the Asian region, I find that nutrient inadequacies, for example, vitamin C, vitamin D, and calcium are very high in both of your countries. Do you think this has got to do with the milk consumption habits of the children in your country, or also with some lactose intolerance issues? And how do you promote the milk drinking habits in your country with this problem?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. In general, I think this part of the world, we are not really, the dairy product is not typical of our original food, let's say. We're more on the plant-based food part. And in the study, actually, I showed this morning, I analyzed the data for animal source food, which is include milk. And I didn't specify what we have found actually the biggest gap between the urban areas or the high income families with low income families, urban areas compared to the rural areas, is the consumption of milk, is the consumption of dairy product. So having said that, and we know in general the nutrient status is better in the higher income families, and we know there's a big gap in terms of milk or dairy product consumption. So there may be a good reason to assume this actually is the reason why we don't see, we see there's a lot of inadequacies because of the milk or the dairy consumption is rather low in the population. In China, actually, there's 50%, more or less 50% of children consume dairy product. And in the city, it's more than 70%. So there's, I think we don't have direct proof. We have to do analysis to say this is probably the reason. But you can imply, we can probably think that could be one of the causes.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
Good afternoon. I'd like to direct my question to Dr. Agedeppa. But before I do so, I'd like to congratulate everyone and thank you for sharing your data with us. They're really very helpful for us. My question is this, Dr. Agedeppa, you mentioned that fruit juice was a major source of nutrients for our kids, but you did not qualify if this is 100% fruit juice. Is it natural? Is it the sweetened beverage that's labeled fruit juice but is actually flavored and fortified? And my second question is that when you measured the vitamin deficiency, did you also take into account that in our culture, in my private practice at least, parents tend to supplement their kids with vitamins a lot. They don't even have to ask for prescription from their doctors. They go to the grocery, it's there, it's available. And so although they may not have reported getting the vitamin from the natural food, they could have gotten it through supplements. Was this taken into account when you did the report?
Unfortunately, in the food intake data that I presented, we did not account for the supplements because in our survey, use of supplements among kids are really very, very low. This is actually more common among the elderly population. Second, the first question is, it's more on the sugary sweetened beverages. I also like to connect my answer with the comment of our gentleman over there. You know, the very concrete example that we have translated policy, science-based evidences to action is actually our our engagement with the Department of Education, wherein there is actually a everyday supplementary feeding school lunch, no, among our school kids. Before, they were not actually trying to serve, you know, this kind of vegetables or fruits in the supplementary feeding. Since the FNRI had developed low-cost indigenous vegetable recipes. These were actually adapted in the supplementary feeding program, and currently we are actually scaling up at the national level already because we have piloted it in 400 schools in Calabarzon, and it's really working. And we have developed modules for both parents and children. The children modules are carried out by the advisors or the class teachers, while the parents' education are being carried out during card day. So these are the things that we need to actually tap or to explore in terms of trying to translate data, evidence-based data into action.
Okay, maybe before you, I would just like to read this question for Dr. Agedeppa again. When do parents...
Sorry, we have to be on time because you're passing...
Just one last question and another question. I'm sure if you go over time 1 minute, it will not affect the total program. Okay, Dr. Agedeppa, when do parents on average decrease...
Again, sorry, I'm not already concentrating.
When do parents on average decrease or stop giving children milk? Is there a perception that they can stop giving milk because they are already eating solids? If so, how can we change this behavior?
It's not actually in my presentation, but for us nutritionists, we always adapt and advocate for 6 months exclusive breastfeeding. And if you still have breast milk, then you continue breastfeeding. However, you have to give proper complementary foods, proper in the sense that it is in the right quantity and right quality.
Okay, and then the last question.
It's not question, just a suggestion. If it is possible, next year, we could present not only about what children eat, but what healthy children eat compared to what unhealthy children eat. Thank you very much.
Okay, so with that, we'll end the panel discussion. And for this afternoon, we learned similarities as well as differences in the nutrition situation of different countries and the reasons why this is so. And with that, we also had discussion on how these research outputs can be utilized by government, by nutrition educators, by health workers, and we hope this will be a lesson learned such that we now implement these lessons in our own practice. With that, thank you.
Thank you for sharing with us your findings and insights. We will be having a 30-minute coffee break.